Camping had always been my favorite way to disconnect from the world. The idea of being surrounded by nature with nothing but trees and sky stretching endlessly above made me feel free. No traffic, no stress, just the peaceful quiet of the wilderness. That's what I thought when I chose to camp in a remote area I'd never been to before. Deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. I wanted total solitude. I found the perfect spot, far away from any trails or campsites. There were no signs of other people, no litter, no footprints. It was exactly what I was looking for. I set up my tent in a small clearing, started a fire, and settled in for the night. The air was cool, the stars were bright, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was perfect. Around midnight, though, something changed. The wind picked up, and what had been a peaceful rustling of leaves turned into something else. Something that sounded like whispering. At first, I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind playing tricks on me. But the longer I sat by the fire, the more distinct the whispers became. They were too rhythmic, too deliberate to be just the wind. My skin began to prickle with unease. I strained to listen, telling myself it was nothing. I even laughed a little to myself, trying to shake off the tension. But then I heard it, my name. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. Tom, Tom. My blood went cold. I hadn't told anyone where I was camping, and there was no one around for miles. How could anyone possibly know my name? I stood up, my eyes darting around the dark woods beyond the firelight, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe the isolation was messing with me. I'd heard stories of people hallucinating when they were alone in the wilderness, especially at night. That had to be it. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, more persistent, as if something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the edge of the clearing, calling my name. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding small and shaky in the vast darkness. There was no response, only more whispers echoing through the trees. Suddenly, I felt a cold gust of wind sweep through the clearing, extinguishing my campfire in an instant. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from my weak flashlight beam. Panic surged through me as I spun around trying to see if anyone or anything was nearby. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, between the trees, a figure stood watching me. It was tall and shadowy, its features hidden in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, as if waiting for me to do something. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were louder now, swirling all around me, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was like a chorus of voices, speaking in a language I didn't understand. My hand tightened around the flashlight, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was paralyzed with fear. Then, without warning, the figure began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, heading straight for me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam shaking as I tried to keep it in my sight. But before I could react, the figure vanished, gone, as if it had never been there. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving me in an eerie, unnatural silence. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was it a trick of the light? Or was there something, or someone out there, watching me? I didn't wait to find out. My survival instincts kicked in, and I hurried back to my tent, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the zipper. I needed to get out of there. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing there again. As I threw my backpack over my shoulder and started to walk away from the campsite, I heard the whispers one last time. They were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Tom, come back." I didn't look back. I didn't stop walking until I reached my car, hours later, at the edge of the forest. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the road behind me. The next day, I told a local hiker about my experience, hoping for some logical explanation. He listened quietly, then went pale. "You camp near the Whispering Woods," he said in a hushed tone. "People who hear their names in those woods, they say they never come back the same." I laughed it off at the time, but now, weeks later, I'm not so sure. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed me out of those woods. Every now and then, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I hear whispers outside my window, faint but unmistakable. They're calling my name. I had been camping for years, but I'd never experienced anything like this. My friends and I had decided to spend the weekend at a remote campsite near a lake we had visited once before. The area was quiet and secluded, exactly what we were looking for. It was miles away from civilization, with no cell phone service, and nothing but nature surrounding us. The perfect escape, we thought. We arrived late in the afternoon, just in time to set up camp before the sun went down. The four of us pitched our tents, gathered some firewood, and started a fire to cook dinner. As night fell, we sat around the fire, telling stories, laughing, and enjoying the peaceful isolation. Around midnight, one of my friends, Chris, said he was going to turn in for the night. He was always the first to crash during our camping trips, so we didn't think much of it. He said goodnight, zipped up his tent, and we continued chatting around the fire. About an hour later, we noticed something strange. Chris's tent, which had been only a few feet away from us, was gone. Not collapsed or moved, just gone. At first, we thought maybe he had taken it down as a prank, but when we called his name, there was no response. We laughed it off, thinking he was trying to scare us, but a cold knot formed in my stomach. We grabbed our flashlights and began searching around the campsite, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. His tent, his sleeping bag, and all of his belongings had completely vanished, as if he had never been there. The fire crackled in the background, the only sound in the eerie silence of the forest. "Chris, this isn't funny," my friend Megan called out, her voice tinged with nervousness. But still, no answer. The woods felt suddenly suffocating, as if the darkness had closed in around us. The usual night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, were gone. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. We split up and searched the area, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and shine my light in every direction, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the trees. But there was nothing. After what felt like hours of searching, we gathered back at the campsite, still with no sign of Chris or his gear. Panic was starting to set in. How could someone and an entire tent just vanish without a trace? We debated whether to hike back to the main road and call for help, but the thought of leaving the campsite in the dark was even more terrifying. We decided to wait until morning, convinced that Chris would show up. We huddled around the fire, too scared to sleep, keeping our flashlights close. The hours dragged on, and every small noise from the woods set us on edge. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the night felt endless. Just before dawn, I heard it, a soft, distant voice. "Help me?" My heart leaped into my throat. It was Chris's voice, but it sounded far away, like it was coming from deep within the woods. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The voice came again, faint but unmistakable. "Help." Without thinking, I started walking toward the sound, my friends calling after me to stop. But I couldn't. Chris was out there. He needed help. The voice led me deeper into the woods, the light from the campfire fading behind me. The further I walked, the more distorted the voice became, as if it was being stretched and twisted by the trees. I stopped when I reached a clearing. There, in the center, was Chris's tent. It was set up exactly as it had been before, his belongings scattered around as if nothing had happened. But there was no sign of him. The air was thick and heavy, and the silence was deafening. I called out his name again, my voice trembling with fear. But there was no answer, just the stillness of the forest. I approached the tent, my heart pounding in my chest. When I unzipped it, the inside was completely empty. Suddenly, the voice came again, closer this time. "Help me, please." I turned around, shining my flashlight into the woods, but there was nothing, just the trees and the shadows. The voice called out again, but this time it sounded different, wrong, as if it wasn't Chris at all. I ran back to the campsite, my legs trembling with fear. When I got there, my friends were packing up their gear, ready to leave as soon as the sun rose. We never found Chris. To this day, I don't know what happened to him, or how an entire tent could vanish only to reappear miles away. All I know is that something was in those woods with us that night, and whatever it wasn't human. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike with my brother Jack. We had grown up hiking and camping, and this time we decided to explore a trail deep in a forest we hadn't been to before. It was well off the beaten path, with no campsites or cabins nearby, just miles and miles of untouched wilderness. We set out early in the morning, eager to get away from everything. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding through dense trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The deeper we went, the more isolated we felt. By late afternoon, we had reached the halfway point of the trail and decided to set up camp near a small clearing. The first sign that something was wrong came at dusk. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects all day, suddenly went silent. It was as if someone had flipped a switch and all the noise just stopped. Jack and I looked at each other, uneasy. We had been camping enough times to know that sudden silence in the woods usually meant one thing: a predator was nearby. We scanned the tree line, looking for signs of movement, but there was nothing. No rustling of leaves, no snapping of twigs, just an eerie, unnatural stillness. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just the normal quiet of the wilderness at night, but the feeling of being watched lingered. After a quick dinner, we climbed into our tents, hoping that sleep would come quickly. But the silence was overwhelming. Every tiny sound, the rustling of our sleeping bags, the creak of the tent poles, seemed magnified in the stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside the tent, watching us. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise, a low, rhythmic tapping like someone was knocking on wood. It was faint, but steady, coming from somewhere in the forest. I lay there, frozen, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Jack was still asleep, his breathing slow and steady. The tapping continued, getting louder and more insistent. It was coming from all around us, echoing through the trees. I sat up, my heart racing, and called Jack's name in a whisper. He didn't respond. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moonlight cast long shadows through the trees, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The tapping sound seemed to come from every direction at once, as if the forest itself was knocking on our tent. Suddenly, Jack let out a strangled scream. I whipped around to see him sitting up, his eyes wide with terror. "Something's outside the tent," he whispered, his voice shaking. I saw it. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out into the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows. But Jack was adamant. He had seen something moving just beyond the tree line. The tapping had stopped now, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. We sat there for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just the heavy stillness of the forest. At dawn, we packed up our gear and started back down the trail without saying a word. The forest seemed different in the daylight, still quiet, but not as menacing. We made it back to the car without any further incidents, but the feeling of unease lingered. It wasn't until weeks later that I found out the forest we had camped in was known for strange occurrences. People had reported hearing tapping noises at night, seeing shadowy figures in the trees, and even disappearing without a trace. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never camp in those woods again.